glad there's space here because I get sort of hyper. I tend to wander around. And it's such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful, beautiful lodge room. I was just marveling at the restoration that your brother Greg has been doing to the ceiling and to the sphinxes and to this magnificent chandelier. This is just a stunning space, and it's a real honor to be here with you. And whenever I'm in traditional lodge rooms, it's kind of a homecoming for me, because not everybody knows this, but Masonic lodge rooms, at least here in the United States, are very close in nature to the kind of floor arrangement that you'll find within an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. When I was a kid, at the age of 13, in the great borough of Queens in New York City, I received an Orthodox bar mitzvah at a very, very small, very deeply observant synagogue. And it was exactly the same setup as what you see in this room. They didn't have sphinxes, to the best of my recollection, but men would read the Torah, the Holy Scroll, from an altar that was placed in the center of the room, which is different from what you find in more contemporary synagogues, where everything's sort of going on up on the stage area or the bima. And this is a feature that has been preserved in Orthodox synagogues. So the footprint of the rooms are very much the same, and it's always moving to me for that reason, among many others, whenever I'm in a Masonic lodge. So I'm so happy to be here. And another reason why it's deeply moving to me whenever I have the opportunity to speak to Masons and friends of Masons, and members of the Order of the Eastern Star, is that I feel very, very deeply, and I feel very, very strongly that some of the best of what we are as a nation emerged from and was solidified in our civic life, in our culture of religious search, spiritual inquiry, by the influence of Freemasonry. And I don't think that mainstream historians, in most cases, have come around to a full realization and a full understanding of how deeply Masonic ideals figured into the founding of the U.S. Republic. And of course, on late night radio and online, people run riot with these ridiculous conspiracy stories and paranoia about Freemasonry, all of which is kind of like a closed circuit of self-referential information that is based on these presumptions and these ideas that have always been false, going back to really the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, that Masonry was somehow the hidden hand or the hidden force behind the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. And it's very easy for people to get hooked into these fantasies, because sometimes when social upheavals do occur in a given society, and this was true in France, and this was true in Russia, the old order gets swept away so completely, and everything that people previously knew, institutionally, hierarchically, economically, religiously, gets so swept away that sometimes people find it hard to believe that social forces build and build and build and suddenly overthrew in a very brief period of time everything that they had known for many generations. And it's easy to kind of default to a kind of conspiratorial mindset and connect dots that are very disparate and very distant, and make this wild assumption that Masonry or some other hidden hand is a force behind these changes, rather than understanding these changes as the result of many, many, many years of brokenness and fissure and dysfunction within a certain system. And so, one tends to find that wherever there are periods of upheaval going on, there's always a certain constituency of people who revert to this kind of conspiratorial thinking. And This was true in the United States in, say, the 1820s, for example, when people were very concerned at that time about corruption within the legal system and at certain high levels of society, and Masonry became a kind of culprit in the minds of some. And that was sort of bound up with an anti-corruption movement that grew out of Andrew Jackson's presidency. But of course, Andrew Jackson himself was a Freemason. So it was one of these ironies of American life that people saw Jacksonian democracy as something that was going to sweep through places of privilege and kind of clean house. And Masonry, again, in the minds of some, kind of got caught up in that campaign. And so ever since that time, there has always been a kind of suspicion of Freemasonry within certain quarters of American life. And it flames up again whenever there are periods of economic uncertainty or radical changes. And it obfuscates the truer facts. It obfuscates the truer facts, which is that Masonry has contributed so deeply to, I think, what really could be called the finest principle in American life, and that is the protection of the individual search for meaning. And I really do believe that whatever periods of division or cultural upheaval we experience as a country, and everyone would agree that we're going through a period of deep division right now, as long as there is a continued protection of the individual search for meaning, we as a nation, I believe, remain healthy. We remain functional. We are doing what I think America was founded to do by the most idealistic of the framers and the founding fathers, which is to provide a place where the individual, free of doctrine or dogma or any kind of enforced belief system, can pursue ethical development, can pursue his or her own perspective on truth, on religion, on ethics. And I think this has been, in many ways, the most successful facet of American life. And I don't think that mainstream historians have yet come around to understand how deeply Freemasonry influenced that set of cultural ideals that took hold very, very early on in our national life. Now, it is a fact, as many of you in this room know, that many of the founders were Freemasons. This included George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Paul Revere. Many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. Many of George Washington's generals were Freemasons. Many of the framers of the Constitution were Freemasons. There were also notable exceptions to this. Figures like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were kind of radical individualists. They were not joiners. Come on in, you guys. They had no connection to Freemasonry. But a great many of the founders did. And these ties that some of the founders had to Freemasonry were not just incidental. These were vital, fundamental parts of their lives. It's difficult for people today to understand just how truly rural a society the American colonies were, and America was, throughout actually much of the 19th century. In the age of Washington, in the age of the War of Independence, America was a place that was based very heavily in agriculture, and there was very, very little community to most people outside of family, agriculture, or maybe some trade or commerce, and church. there were, really at that time, maybe 3 hospitals in the entire country, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, one in New York City. You had Harvard established as a university, you had some seminaries, but you didn't have teaching hospitals, you didn't have cathedrals, you didn't have universities anywhere near on the scale that we understand them today. And your life was very, very heavily regulated by farm or commerce, church, and family. That's what was here as far as civilization went. So for an individual to make a decision to join a fraternal order represented a huge foundational commitment in that person's life. The Fraternal Order of Freemasonry was one that suddenly provided the individual with an influence and a community and a place of learning that went outside of those very, very few institutions that made up American life in the colonial age. So if you were making a decision as an adult to become a Freemason, you were making a decision that was almost as monumental as what church you would belong to or what profession you would enter into. It was a material commitment in a person's life. There was nothing light about it. We're no longer a nation of joiners today, it seems. All the civic organizations in our nation have experienced declining membership. The JCs, the 4-H, the Knights of Columbus, Masonry, Knights of Pythias. My father was a member of the Knights of Pythias, and he never went to any of the meetings. And I said, Dad, you never attend any of the meetings of the Knights of Pythias. Why are you a member? And he said, so I have a place to be buried. Because he just wanted to bury him in a foot. So that was why Dad joined the fraternal organization. But back in the colonial era, it was a huge commitment. So when a Washington or a Franklin would commit himself to joining Masonry, it was a lifelong foundational dedication. There was nothing casual about it. And certainly, as different states, Virginia, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York, began to frame different articles of religious freedom, things that eventually took shape when they were codified as the Constitution. Certainly, there were influences coming from Europe on American minds. Thomas Paine was very influenced by the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. Thomas Jefferson was very heavily influenced by the theology of Unitarianism, and again, some of the rationalist and Enlightenment philosophers who were coming into vogue in Europe. So those influences were there. I don't mean for a second to discount any of that. But Masonry, too, was an enormous influence on those founders who were involved. Not only because within Masonry you had a fraternity that represented a pillar of their social and civic life, but within Masonry you had interjected into this nascent developing society that was still in kind of a womb-like state, an organization that believed that people of different religions could function together within a single organization. That was a radical idea in Europe and the United States in the colonial era. You had an organization that practiced internal democracy, that elected its own leadership. You had an organization that saw as central to its mission the revival and the maintenance of ancient symbols as codes to ethical development. The all-seeing eye, the eye and the pyramid, the obelisk, the pentagram, the skull and crossbones. All of these things were seen as symbols that belonged to the ancient world, but that were not museum pieces, were living ideas that could be used in pursuit of ethical development in the here and now. And this was not something, that was going on just anywhere in other parts of life. This was something, at least here in the U.S., or in the American, what were still the American colonies at that time, this was something that was almost exclusive to Freemasonry. Almost exclusive to Freemasonry. And I think you can hear echoes of Masonic philosophy in some of Washington's earliest statements and letters and proclamations, including in the first term of his presidency, when he famously sent a letter to the congregants of Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island, saying to them that minority religions were no longer considered to be guests in the American Republic, but actually were householders who could have a seat at the table along with everybody else. And he said, echoing something that a correspondent had written to him originally, he said, in our country, we give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. I think you hear tones of Masonic ideals in that statement. And much more so, you hear tones of Freemasonic values in the symbols that make up the Great Seal of the United States of America, particularly the reverse of the Great Seal, beautiful, beautiful pyramid with the Eye of Providence hovering above it. I think what this symbol says to us is that our earthly works are incomplete without some kind of inner realization, without some kind of ethical development. And the Latin maxim surrounding the Great Seal reads, Annuit septus noos ordo seclorum, which can be roughly, if somewhat poetically translated as, God smiles on our new order of the ages. In fact, I like it so much that I even got a tattoo of it right here. And I want to say something about the design of the Great Seal and how I think Masonic values figured into it and why it was so important as an expression of earliest American values and remains so important. It's funny, those of us who were sitting in the room earlier found this dollar bill just sitting around here. Nobody would claim it. And it went from the floor to the podium to the altar, and I finally thought, well, I'll use it as a prop since I was planning to talk about the Great Seal anyway, and it appears on the back of our dollar bill. It's good as an illustrative stage prop. So I'm glad whoever left the dollar bill here, thanks to him or her, because it provided me with something very helpful to hold up. Now, this alluring symbol of the eye in the pyramid is familiar to people of every walk of American life today. Anybody who carries around a dollar bill carries it in the back of his or her pocket. And it's this deeply mysterious, esoteric symbol, and yet here it is, hidden in plain sight. We look at it virtually every day, many times a day. Where did it come from, and what does it mean? It was on July 4th, 1776, appropriately enough, that the Continental Congress formed a committee which was intended to oversee and design a great seal for the new republic. And the committee was made up of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, a Freemason. So they were charged with overseeing and designing what would become the seal of the republic. And interestingly enough, the seal that they came up with, it of course features the more familiar American eagle on the front, clutching in its claws, the olive branches and the arrows, and on the reverse, the famous iron pyramid. But the iron pyramid was actually unknown to most Americans for many, many generations. It didn't appear on the back of our dollar bill until 1935. And there's interesting history behind that in itself, which also involves Freemasonry. First of all, it's important to note that the eye in the pyramid, strictly speaking, is not a direct leaf out of Freemasonry, but I do believe that it was very deeply inspired by Masonic values. As I said, the Continental Congress was charged with designing a Great Seal July 4th, 1776. It wasn't until about 5 years later that the design was completed and approved. Obviously, they had other things to do in the interim period. But the design that they did come up with, I think, demonstrates Masonic philosophy to the core, and it demonstrates values that were held very, very dear by the framers of the country. Now, I've mentioned the symbolism, the imagery, the pyramid, which represents a kind of worldly creation, material advancement, progress, enterprise, commerce. It's all very, very important, but it is incomplete without the blessing of the eye of providence, both within and without. Without the eye of providence, you have a pyramid that just kind of stands as an empty monument to humanity's capacity for enterprise, growth, progress. But it's inner growth, and it's the connection with higher forces that caps the pyramid, that really makes it eternal, And the founders and Freemasons alike, they saw the New Republic as a place that was part of a historical chain of great civilizations that pursued and protected the individual search for meaning. This included the empires of ancient Egypt, Persia, Babylon, Greece, Rome. They saw the New Republic as one that was part of this great chain of empires that sustained and encouraged the study of highest truths. Now, mind you, the founders and Masons alike adopted symbols of antiquity, not symbols from the old world, not symbols of Europe. They were not so much interested in recreating and replicating a kind of aristocratic-based, hierarchical religious system. And to this day, I mean, look at the room that we're in. We have sphinxes, we have these beautiful images that could come from ancient Persian, Egyptian, and Hellenic civilizations. There's a pastiche of images here that are both Far Eastern and Greek, Hellenic. And this was part of the revolutionary spirit of both above-ground masonry and the work of the founders, which was to say, we don't want to create a kind of religious system that's tied up with government and rank and hierarchy, where the nobles get to sit in the front rows, and then the people who serve them get to sit in the back rows, and the working people and the farmers and the agricultural folks get to sit in the way back rows, which is actually what the cathedrals, for all their beauty and splendor and wonder, were like as a social institution back in the old world. They were vaulting backwards to the past and saying, we want to join the order of that chain of civilizations that were both materially great and based in a deep veneration and search for humanity's relation to the highest. So you have the eye, you have the all-seeing eye completing the pyramid. And then there's this wonderful Latin slogan, as I was saying, Annulus septis novus ordo seclorum, which loosely can be translated as God smiles on our new order of the ages. absolutely beautiful. And people today on the internet and on late night radio use the phrase New World Order. It's supposed to be something fearsome and terrible, something sinister. This term was never used as something sinister. It was used to connote great ideals. It was beautiful. Now, in fact, the term New World Order wasn't even very widely heard, but it was inadvertently revived, not intentionally in a negative way, by President George H.W. Bush, who gave 2 speeches to Congress during the first Iraq War. One was on the eve of the war, and one was just following the war. And in both speeches, he said that once this war is settled, we'll be able to have commerce and cultural exchange and maybe some sort of a peace agreement in the Middle East. And we will usher in a new world order of healthful affairs among the nations. So he was, or the speechwriters were, using a phrase that came from the reverse of the Great Seal of our nation. It wasn't being used in the sinister way that in the early days of the internet it was later adopted as. And in fact, as I was mentioning, for many generations following the design of the Great Seal, and it was approved in 1781, most Americans were unfamiliar with it because it was just used for official business or as some kind of an imprimatur or seal of validation on official documents. Most people hadn't really seen it. But flash forward to the 20th century, it was revived and placed on the back of our dollar bill by 2 Freemasons who also happened to be president and vice president at that time. And that was Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of Agriculture, who later became his second vice president, Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace, who was from an Iowan farming family and was probably the greatest Secretary of Agriculture our nation ever had, saved thousands of family farms during the Great Depression. Wallace was a lifelong Freemason. And Wallace was a very, very deeply committed Freemason. Wallace was interested in Masonry, both in its esoteric variants and its fraternal variants. Wallace was interested in Tibetan Buddhism. He was interested in astrology. He engaged in studies of esoterica and the occult. And he was really a wonderful, wonderful man. And if he had one flaw, it was that he had difficulty understanding that other people, reporters and other political figures, couldn't really grasp and get their arms around the seriousness of his own spiritual search. And people would make fun of him as being kind of a weirdo and flighty, and he was none of those things. He was a deeply, deeply serious man who came from a long line of scientific agriculturalists. In fact, he started a company that is widely heard of, including by many people who have never set foot on a farm, and that's the seed company Pioneer Hybrid, which I'm sure most people in this room have heard of. He was the editor of a magazine called Wallace's Farmer, which had been started by his grandfather. And farming almanacs back in the day, you still see this even in the Farmer's Almanac today, would use zodiac lore and horoscopes to try to govern propitious seasons or periods of the month for planting. And Wallace was also a very serious and dedicated scientific agriculturalist. And as I mentioned, he was Secretary of Agriculture, excuse me, during the Great Depression. And he actually came from a Republican background. His father had been Secretary of Agriculture in the administration of Warren Harding. And Roosevelt selected Wallace as his Secretary of Agriculture because he wanted to bring some Republican pedigree into his administration. And Wallace introduced reforms, agricultural reforms, into American life that, as I said, were probably largely responsible for saving the family farm, and certainly thousands of family farms during the Great Depression. These were things like crop rotation, curbing overproduction of both crops and meat from livestock, using genetically engineered seeds. He introduced all kinds of reforms that helped stabilize the finances of American family farmers. And in fact, his reforms were later adopted in Latin America and probably resulted in saving thousands upon thousands of people from hunger. He was, quite honestly, I think, the greatest Secretary of Agriculture in American history. And he became so popular a figure that Roosevelt later named him his second vice president, prior to Harry Truman. Little historical side note, Time magazine, in its infinite wisdom, devised a list several years ago of the 10 worst vice presidents in American history. And number one at the top of the list was Henry Wallace. And this was probably written by some 19-year-old intern, while everybody was out at lunch. And I thought to myself, how easy it is, to draw up this pithy list of 10 worst vice presidents in American history. Why 10? Why not 7? We like 10, okay. And, they put Wallace at the top of the list, having no appreciation that this man was the greatest scientific agriculturalist, arguably, in our country's history, the greatest Secretary of Agriculture we've ever had. And also, you should be proud to know, a lifelong Freemason, and somebody with a real deep and abiding love for Masonry all his life. So while Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture in 1935, he got to thinking that the nation needed kind of a new set of symbols that would help inspire the public. The country was still caught in the Great Depression, and he was very interested in portentous imagery. This grew out of his dedication to Freemasonry, and I think it was entirely positive. And he was asking himself, what symbols are there in our national life that could be revived and could help inspire the public? And so he comes across the reverse of the Great Seal, the eye in the pyramid, this symbol that was designed by our founders, but had largely been forgotten about, and that, as I was suggesting earlier, had very strong Masonic overtones. So he approaches Roosevelt, his boss, and suggests to him, we should take this symbol and we should mint it into a special coin, some kind of a commemorative coin. And in the same way that this symbol calls for a new order of the ages, we're calling for a new deal of the ages. We're reigniting America's commitment to its earliest values. In the same way that the founders felt that they were creating something new and exciting and powerful and dynamic in this new nation, we, in the midst of the Great Depression, need to reconnect with that set of ideals. And Roosevelt, also a Freemason, liked the idea, but he decided to do Wallace one better. And he said, rather than mint some sort of a special coin, we're actually going to take this symbol and we're going to put it on the back of the dollar bill. It was amazing that these things could happen back in the day. I mean, today, we can't even figure out, do we want a Sacagawea coin? Do we want to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill? We can't do anything. But Roosevelt decides effectively with the stroke of a pen that we're going to take this beautiful, ancient-inspired esoteric symbol and boom, we're going to put it on the back of the dollar bill. And here's where it gets really interesting. There are records that exist in the archives of the Treasury Department, and you can find these online, and I encourage you to go take a look at it, because I want you to see these things with your own eyes, and it's very important also to understand understand that everything I'm talking about tonight has a family tree of truth and facts and documents behind it, and they're out there. Roosevelt personally supervised the design of the Great Seal on the back of the bill, but he made a last-minute decision, and you can find this in Treasury Department records in Roosevelt's own hand in pencil on the back of a prototype design. He reversed the order of the two symbols, placing the more esoteric eye and pyramid over here on the left. We, of course, read from left to right in America in the English language, so your eye is naturally drawn to the left whenever you're looking at a page or a list or a piece of paper. And he effectively put the symbol of the iron pyramid, the more esoteric symbol, on the left on our bill to give it the position of primary prominence. It's what you see first. So when people think of the reverse of the dollar bill, it's the eye in the pyramid that holds the prominent position, and the more familiar American eagle comes second, so to speak. Roosevelt, in his own hand, flipped the original order of the design. That is how significantly and seriously he took this symbol. So every day we carry around this beautiful Masonic-inspired symbol in our pockets, as long as we still use currency. There are some restaurants, I don't know if this is a fact that you all have gone through, but there are some restaurants now that are no longer actually taking dollars, they only take plastic. I was at a restaurant a few months ago and I tried to give them dollars and they actually wouldn't take my money. And I thought, okay, this is strange, but for the time being, we're still carrying dollars in our pockets. So you carry this symbol with you every day, and oddly enough, there's a fraction of people who have some sinister association with it, whereas it's an encapsulation, it's an encryptment of our greatest national ideals. And those ideals were expressed in a language of symbolism inspired by Freemasonry. This is not a small thing. This is part of the fabric of our public life, in as much as the Statue of Liberty is, in as much as a portrait of George Washington is. It's a basic foundation stone of our life, and it expresses our highest civic values. That was the case in many ways with Freemasonry. Now, I know that the lodges here in this state recognize Prince Hall Masonry, and this lodge in particular has had exchanges and contact with Prince Hall lodges, which I think is wonderful, because Prince Hall is also part of an important story of the ideals of Freemasonry in American life. Now, it's funny how it's difficult to get our arms around our own history sometimes. According to the traditional telling, Prince Hall Masonry was founded in 1775, a year before the American Revolution, when a man named Prince Hall, who was a leather worker, a freedman of color, leather worker from Boston, appealed to a British Army garrison outside of Boston for a Freemasonic charter, and he was granted one. But the timing, it's recently come to light that actually the date 1775 is incorrect. The primary documents demonstrate that Prince Hall Masonry was actually founded in 1778. And it's funny how these mistakes get made and get codified into our historical memory. The fact is, and some direct research has been done on this by two Masons, a friend of mine named Oscar Ayene, and a brilliant historian named Jim Hairston Bay, who published a book on this topic called Landmarks of Our Fathers. Jim did the forensics, and he found primary documentation that demonstrated that the year 1775 is the wrong date for Prince Hall's founding, even though Prince Hall Masonry itself references that date. The reason is this. The Massachusetts Historical Society, in about 1779, listed the date of Prince Hall's founding as 1775, and the Massachusetts Historical Society records are of such a vintage and are so close in time to the actual founding of Prince Hall that they were naturally taken as a reliable source by historians. But what INA and Hairston have found is that there are actually no meeting notes demarcating any kind of Prince Hall activity until an initially recorded meeting in the year 1778. The reason that this is so important to me as a historian is that historians tend to rely upon repeat references to dates and figures and ideas, and if a reference is repeated often enough, it gets canonized, it gets adopted as being scriptural fact. And what's absolutely remarkable is sometimes you start to peel back the onion and you find that a long time ago, some piece of record keeping or some venerable source or some source that just seems unimpeachable was just wrong. And it happens all the time, especially with the kind of history that I deal with. But it happens with mainstream history as well. I have found quotes from Thomas Edison that he never uttered. I have found references to stories about things that were said by Arthur Conan Doyle and other famous authors that they never uttered. Every famous and pithy expression was supposed to be uttered by Napoleon at one point or another, and no one ever sort of peels back the layers and asks, did this really happen? Did this really occur? So these two Masonic historians have done yeoman's work, and they really deserve to be celebrated for it because they have set right the timeline of Prince Hall Masonry. But the story that I'm telling about Prince Hall is not directly dependent upon this timeline, but it is very, very important to it. Now, the fact is, Prince Hall Masonry, as an African-American tradition of Masonry, was founded in 1778, and it began under the name of African Lodge No. 1, and its first Grand Master was this free man of color, a Boston leather worker, by the name of Prince Hall, and in generations ahead, to honor him as the inceptive Grand Master of African Lodge No. 1, the movement referred to itself as Prince Hall Masonry. Now, Prince Hall's signature appeared on the very first petitions that we know of in American life or in American colonial life to end slavery in 1777, and then a year later in 1778. And one of the things that I always try to point out to people, and this needs to be stated very, very carefully so it's not misunderstood, is that I'm not saying that abolitionism began with Freemasonry. It did not. Abolitionism had many sources, including Quakerism and different humanistic and religious and ethical voices that formed into the abolitionist movement in the North and in the South. But the first black-led abolitionist movement in American life was Freemasonic in nature. It was Freemasonic in nature, and that was Prince Hall Masonry. And Prince Hall Masonry just has an extraordinary history, and I'm very encouraged that in your state and in this lodge in particular, there's acceptance and exchange and interaction with Prince Hall Masonry, because I think it's a very, very important and central part of American history. There are many ways in which Masonry created openness in American life, and here is one of the, in a way, one of the strangest, one of the least known, and I think one of the most noble. The French hero of the American Revolutionary War, the Marquis de Lafayette, close friend of George Washington, was himself also a Freemason. In fact, in one of the meeting rooms of the Grand Lodge of New York State, they have parallel portraits of Washington and Lafayette facing one another from across one of the meeting rooms. And Lafayette was deeply interested in the esoteric tenets of Freemasonry. And he became a student of someone that you may have heard of, a kind of occult healer and experimenter named Franz Anton Mesmer, who was very popular in Paris, especially in aristocratic circles in the late 1770s. Mesmer, who was a Swiss-born lawyer and kind of a self-styled healer, showed up in Paris in 1778, and he told everyone that he had this new revolutionary cryptic style of healing people, that people who were suffering from physical or emotional disorders could be placed into a kind of trance state by Mesmer waving his hands in front of their eyes. Today we call this hypnotism, but back then it was called mesmerism. And Mesmer said that when he placed patients into some kind of a trance state, he could then manipulate this ethereal force that ran through them, and this ethereal force that animated all of life, which he called animal magnetism. That's where the term comes from. And so Mesmer believed and taught that when you're placed into a trance state, if you're suffering from tuberculosis or a mental disorder or even blindness or other maladies, it's because something is out of balance with your animal magnetism, with this invisible ethereal force that suffuses all of life. And that through the use of music and magnets and color and light, he could realign your animal magnetism. And lots of people in Paris, including very highly placed people in Parisian society, reported extraordinary cures under the influence of mesmerism. Now, it's very commonly the case that a great innovator never really understands what he or she is working with, and that it's later generations who take an idea and refine it so that it can be useful. What some of Mesmer's best students came to realize, especially in the years following his death in 1815, what some of them came to realize is that there wasn't really this invisible magnetic fluid animating all of life, but that the master had identified and come upon some kind of invisible or covert or subliminal mind. He had made the earliest discovery of the subconscious, which is why when people entered these trance states and received these powerful hypnotic suggestions from Mesmer, a lot of them did report healings. Now, the term subconscious mind or unconscious mind, which we use very commonly today, was not available to people back in the colonial age. If you said the word mind to people back then, they thought, well, sure, the mind is what I use to get from one place to another. It's what I use to read. It's what I use to memorize things. It's what I use to make lists. But there was no conception that there was this subliminal or subconscious or unseen mind where suggestions or memories were lodged, and that this unseen or subconscious mind could even be the engine behind all of our activities and behind all of the conflicts or the repetitions that went on in our lives. That point of view didn't really come into circulation until the 1890s, particularly through the work of the American philosopher William James, and then it was widely popularized by Sigmund Freud, who change subconscious to unconscious. And now, today, if you use the term subconscious, everybody knows what you're talking about. Everybody takes for granted, oh yeah, I have this mind that can remember the theme song from Lost in Space or whatever it is. And yeah, people believe and understand that there are traumas or conflicts or suggestions that we might not acknowledge in our day-to-day life, but that are lodged somewhere. That's what Mesmer seems to have really discovered. So he needs to be remembered as much more than just this weird, eccentric guy who blew through Paris in the pre-revolutionary age. He was possessed of an extraordinary insight into human nature. He just didn't associate it with the mind. He associated it with some invisible magnetic fluid. The results that grew from mesmerism were impressive. And so the Marquis de Lafayette, this Freemason, this hero of the American Revolution, became a student of Mesmer's. And he was very close with Mesmer. And after the War of Independence was over, Lafayette, who was back in France at that time, decided in the summer of 1784 that he was going to make a trip to America, to the New Republic. And he was coming for two reasons. One, he wanted to see his old friend, George Washington. They remained very close. And two, Mesmer was interested in some developments that were cropping up in America. There were certain euphoric religions in America, specifically the Quakers and the Shakers, and they both came from the same roots. And the Quakers and the Shakers would have prayer meetings and services where everybody would kind of shake and dance in ecstasy to the Holy Spirit. They would speak in tongues. They would report seeing visions of angels and spirits from the afterlife and receiving spirit communications. Mesmer used the term seance to describe his sessions, his sittings. It's a French word that can be loosely translated as sitting. And the term seance really wouldn't enter American life until the mid-19th century. But the Shakers and the Quakers were engaged in things that we today might call a seance. They would sit in a circle around a table with joined hands, and the Shakers would report getting drunk on spiritual wine. They would report receiving spirit messages from vanquished Native American tribes or from ancestors who had passed over to the other world. The Shakers would create beautiful works of art or songs or hymns that they described as spirit gifts, these gifts from the other world. And Lafayette was very interested in the question of whether the mental state in which the Shakers and the Quakers were receiving these spirit communications was the same kind of state that people were under when they were in a mesmeric trance. He wanted to make a comparison. So that was one of his reasons for coming to the United States. It was also an occasion for a lot of different towns and localities to honor him and to name streets and avenues and public squares in his honor. I mean, if you look around, every 10th town or locality or road in America is called Lafayette. Certainly this is the case in New York State. But a lot of people don't know that he was celebrated as a hero because he was actually coming here to study what he considered manifestations of mesmerism among some of the early euphoric American religions, and also to see his friend George Washington. Now, I came upon this funny reference in a journal of German-American history from the early 20th century, where supposedly, Lafayette was in the court of Louis XVI, and Louis was very suspicious of Mesmer. Louis XVI didn't really like Mesmer and regarded Mesmer at a certain distance, because it's funny how it's difficult for us sometimes to understand how people could get very nervous and very kind of worked up politically over something that looked back on doesn't seem political at all. I mean, what I'm describing about Mesmer doesn't seem very political, the idea of animal magnetism. But to some people, including the royal court, mesmerism was politically very threatening back in the day, because if all people were animated by this invisible animal magnetism, so went Mesmer's theory, it meant that all people were basically the same, right? That there weren't differences between aristocrats and working folks, or plantation owners and slaves. If everybody was susceptible to a Masonic trance, then everybody was pretty much the same when you get down to the basics of life. And everything in France in that pre-revolutionary period, I think this is still true in French today, everything had some sort of a political overtone or meaning. So Mesmer was regarded with a certain degree of suspicion. And Louis XVI decided that he wanted to name a blue ribbon panel, a royally appointed panel, to study this character, Mesmer. And the chair of the panel was none other than America's ambassador to France at the time, Benjamin Franklin. And so Franklin chaired this royal panel that was intended to study Mesmer's methods. And they studied him for several months. Mesmer would not cooperate with him. He left Paris, and some of his students were there, and they worked with some of his students, and they worked with some patients. And the panel concluded that this whole animal magnetism thing was just a farce. And they said there were certain cases where recovery was apparent, but the relief that the patient experienced, so the panel wrote to King Louis, was all in the imagination. It was all in the imagination. But the panel stopped short at probing the most tantalizing question that it has raised. If it's all in the imagination, so to speak, then why should anything be happening at all? And what is this thing called imagination? If somebody's suffering from a debilitating physical malady, and then they report relief, and the relief is lasting, and this Royal Commission says, it's all in the imagination. What is imagination? What is meant by that? They left dangling their most tantalizing question. Their most tantalizing question. This is why concepts of the subconscious mind didn't really enter our public life until well over a century later. Well over a century later. They didn't dig deep enough. They didn't probe deep enough. Benjamin Franklin was a great, great scientist, but this panel gave to Louis XVI exactly what he wanted, which was supposed proof that Mesmer was nothing but a charlatan. So Louis did not like Mesmer, and one day, according to this journal article I read, Lafayette shows up in the royal court, and he lets King Louis know that he's going to be journeying to America to visit George Washington and do some traveling around in the New Republic. And Louis supposedly says to him, "Aha! And what will General Washington think when he finds out that his best friend is an apprentice of this sorcerer, Mesmer?" And I got to wondering, did Louis actually say that? And how do we know that Louis said that? There's all these things that get attributed to various historical figures. I have no idea whether Napoleon really said, every plan fails immediately on contact with the enemy. You know, was somebody following him with a quill and, parchment as he walked across the battlefield at Waterloo? But I got to wondering, how do we know Louis really said that? And man, let me tell you, I searched and searched and searched and searched, and only the French would do this. It turns out that there was this nobleman in Louis's court who, years and years later, had survived the revolution, the reign of terror, and he wrote this 12-volume compendium in French of pithy things that were said in the court of Louis XVI, and just kind of comings and goings. Most of it was just gossip and rumor and sort of tawdry stories about one aristocrat and another having an affair and all this, but only in France would this be, a 12-volume set. And sure enough, in this 12-volume set, I found in the original French by somebody who claimed to be there in earshot that Louis had said these very words to to Lafayette. But as it turned out, what King Louis didn't know was that George Washington was already aware that his best friend, Lafayette, was a student of the sorcerer Mesmer. Because, and this is really wild, but it's an absolute fact, you can find it in the Library of Congress, George Washington and Mesmer had exchanged letters. Because Lafayette, the Freemason, a man who was dedicated to absolute search and unfettered discovery, he introduced the two of them by correspondence. And Mesmer was interested in founding what he called these universal societies of truth. That's how he referred to his schools. I mean, again, you know, the French don't do anything small. It can't be a school. It has to be a universal society of truth. I see somebody up there. Is that the Phantom of the Opera? Is this a haunted lodge building? Yes? And so Mesmer wrote a letter to George Washington. He wrote a couple of letters asking him for permission to found his universal societies of truth here in the United States and teach people mesmerism. And Washington was very diplomatic about the whole thing. He didn't really want to go on record saying, you know, bravo, you just seem like a great guy. Why don't you come here and start your schools? He said, my friend Lafayette has described your theories and your successes to me, and if these things have been described to me accurately, then surely great credit will go to the person who has founded these discoveries as one of the great intellects of our age. But Washington was being very diplomatic and kind of leaving himself an out and saying, you know, if these things should turn out to be true. But he did say to Mesmer, here in the New Republic, you don't need to receive government permission in order to start up a school or any kind of assembly or any kind of a religious organization. So if you feel like starting up your societies of universal truth here in the United States, you're perfectly welcome to. But Mesmer never did follow up. His health was suffering a little bit at that time. Maybe we should revive that. Maybe we should start up Mesmer's Institutes of Universal Truth here in the U.S. We'll start a revival, a mesmeric revival. I think that would be a good idea. That goes on my list. And so this never transpired, but it's absolutely fascinating that Washington not only received, but responded to correspondence from this person who was held in very deep suspicion back in Paris and who was viewed as some sort of a sorcerer, some sort of an occult figure. But this was the mood and the temperament that Masonic connections helped to instill at the highest levels of American life. And I think it was very positive. This willingness to say, how do I know this person is some sort of a scoundrel or a charlatan? Sure, Benjamin Franklin says so, but my friend Lafayette says something else. And sure, if he wants to start up his societies of universal truth here in the New Republic, he's welcome to do so. He doesn't need anybody's permission. I mean, yes, of course, there were terrible contradictions going on in American life at that time. You had the destruction of the Native American culture, you had the institution of slavery, you had a civil war just a couple of generations off in the future, but you also had, and have always had, a tremendous amount of not only religious toleration, because that doesn't quite get at it, but a kind of radical ecumenism, a protection of the search, no matter how far it went, no matter what questions were being probed. If an individual comported himself within the laws and the framework of the society, no question was erased. No one could take your question from you. No one could eradicate your question. And you required the permission of no one to pursue your question. Those were not only Masonic values, but they were values that were inculcated in American life by Masonic relationships. The fact that Mesmer didn't have to care that his best friend, George Washington, as Louis teased him, was a sorcerer's apprentice, or would find out that he was a sorcerer's apprentice. The very fact that he was unencumbered and unembarrassed and came to America to study mesmerism, to introduce Washington to Mesmer through correspondence, this lack of encumbrance, this lack of permission seeking, this lack of embarrassment, it entered the groundwater of the country. It entered the groundwater of the country. We think, gee, we've got a great Constitution, and yes, that's true. But the Constitution grew out of a culture of assembly and free speech and free religious practice that was already there. It codified what was already there, and it was there in part because of the influence of Freemasonry. Absolutely, absolutely. Without the influence of Freemasonry, we would be a lesser society. We would be a lesser country. These people, so far as I'm concerned, were heroic because they lived by the internal light of ideas. And that's what I want people in our world today to understand about Freemasonry. Why are kids not taught this stuff? Kids should be taught this stuff. And it's stuff that kids relate to. You know, I speak sometimes at different schools, and you know, in New York State, there's a fair number of Shaker villages preserved, and the kids get brought to them by the busload and told, well, here's a chair, and here's a broom, and here's a packet of seeds. And of course they're bored, but they're never told how exciting the Shakers were, and how exuberant they were, and what they stood for. And as I was saying, you know, every third street in town in America is named Lafayette, but who was this guy? Who was this guy? He was a hero in the War of Independence. He was a Freemason. He was a total free thinker. He was wild. You know, he's getting teased by the King of France. He's coming here. He's studying all these different religions. You know, he's not just some name on a street somewhere. And this beautiful symbol on the back of our dollar bill, it's not just some weird symbol. It came from someplace. It means something. You know, I want kids to understand this. And I always tell people when they indulge in these conspiracy theories online or on late night radio, if only you knew, if only you knew, because the real facts are 10 times as exciting as anything that fantasy would hold. And they have the actual benefit of being true. Imagine that. Imagine that. And I'm hopeful for Masonry's future, because I really do believe in every Masonic lodge that I've traveled to, and I've had the opportunity to be out west, to be east, to be in the south. I've spoken in a fair number of lodges, and I see that there's a lot of life within lodges. We may not be a nation of joiners anymore. Americans and people all over the world, actually, because of digital culture, are not really joiners in the way that they used to be. But I do see younger people coming in. I mean, take a look around. You know, there's actually a reasonable number of younger people here. I know there are people interested in esoteric Masonry. I know in the state of Colorado, there's a lot of young people who are very interested in esoteric Masonry, who are coming up through the ranks. I just have a wonderful relationship with the Grand Lodge of New York State, where they've had me to speak in the lodge rooms several times now, and sometimes the crowd is so big that we have to actually split up the nights into 2 parts. I mean, when's the last time that anybody had to, you know, turn people away from a lecture on American history? It seems to me that's a sign of health. You know, it's like, oh gee, we have a waiting list. It's like, that's good news. There should be a waiting list for lectures on Masonic history. And I'm proud to say that at the Grand Lodge of New York, we've actually had waiting lists, and I think that's just terrific. I also feel that you all as Masons, you have something so important to impart to the public today in the 21st century. This is what it is. You possess, and you have been, the custodians and the keepers of a language of myth that continues, a language of symbol that continues to enthrall people today, People are fascinated with the symbols that emerge and have been vouchsafed by Freemasonry. Absolutely fascinated. Hip-hop culture is shot through with images of the eye and the pyramid, the all-seeing eye, the obelisk, the square and compass, the Masonic letter G. I was asked by NPR to do this story about, is Jay-Z a Freemason? To which I respond, I wish, But, he on his clothing brands and in his use of the all-seeing eye or the eye of providence makes a very, very steady use of Masonic symbols, as do other hip-hop artists. And he understands, as an artist, that these symbols have a unique magnetism. There are certain symbols that maintain an absolute hold on the imagination. You can't look away from them. They include the pyramid, they include the obelisk, they include the all-seeing eye, they include the crucifix, they include the Star of David, they include the square and compass, they include the Masonic letter G, they include the serpent, they include the skull or the skull and crossbones. Many of these symbols have currency within Masonry, and people are fascinated by them. You put them up on a billboard on a highway somewhere, and everybody will look. They're magnetic. They're powerful. Even if people can't decode the language that's behind them, they feel instinctively that these symbols embody truth. They feel it instinctively. Put a pentagram somewhere, you have one right there. People feel it. Their eyes are just immediately drawn to it. Why is that? Because I think that we have an instinct for truth. We have an instinct for truth, even if we can't decipher or decode what it is that symbol embodies. But you all can. You all can. You all are the custodians of an ancient tradition. Masonry is a vessel that has preserved these symbols of truth. And I really do believe in my heart that you can speak to this present generation that is so fascinated with these symbols, sometimes frightened of them, but knows that they are in the direction of something very, very, very significant. Now, another fantasy that people engage in is the whole idea of the existence of something called the Illuminati, which was sort of a renegade, we'll say it was kind of a renegade, semi-Masonic order, self-styled, not accepted, obviously, that was formed in Bavaria in the age of the revolutions. The Illuminati wanted to really more or less kind of invade Freemasonic lodges and turn them into organs for political dissent. But they had their own history, and it was a noble history. They have existed for about 230 years, but every time I walk on a basketball court and somebody sees my eye and pyramid tattoo or one of my various esoteric symbols, they're like, oh, are you a member of the Illuminati? And of course, yes, of course I am, and I'm designing ads to run during the Super Bowl halftime show, because what else would a secret society do? I'm always fascinated that Alex Jones and company think that, Lady Gaga is a member of the Illuminati, and what would she do but advertise this during a Doritos commercial during the Super Bowl or something? But the fact that people harbor these fascinations, it represents, obviously, conspiratorial thinking represents a certain kind of paranoia, which is unhealthy, because it promotes this us versus them mentality. But it also shows, a number of things. It shows, first of all, also a wish for greater transparency in our culture, in our government institutions, in our financial institutions, and I do think that's healthy. But it also shows this attraction to these symbols with all the distractions that exist in our world, with the lack of quiet that's all around us. Everybody's always on their phones. We're getting bombarded advertisements, shows, and noise, and music, wherever we go, wherever we go. And yet, for all that, people, including young people, including people within the world of hip-hop culture, are so drawn and attracted to these symbols. They know instinctively that these symbols vibrate power. They emanate truth and power, but they cannot decrypt them. They cannot decipher them. And neither can the conspiracy folk who have no idea what these symbols mean. But you all, as I was saying, you do. Because you understand that these symbols are codes to ethical development, are codes to inner development. And there's a yawning need out there in our culture for someone to step in and say, hey, you're fascinated with all these occult and esoteric symbols. You're right to be fascinated. We're fascinated by them too. And guess what? We actually live by them. And we know what they mean. And we can share that with you. And we have organizations that can help explain and decipher these things for you and show you how these are building blocks to a more powerful life, to a more ethical life, to a more aware life and existence. Just think. You know, Masonry has been through all these twists and turns in its history. It has this wonderful foundational arterial role that is played in American life. And for all the bad-mouthing, for all the nonsense that goes on, nothing can erase truth. Nothing can erase truth. Nothing can erase people's innate fascination with the symbols that are the life's blood of the Freemasonic search and the search for ethical development. And you are the custodians of those symbols. You have been given a kind of sacred, holy role in the world today. And the world needs to hear from you. The world needs to hear from you. Because Masonry, both in history and today again, plays and can play a vital, vital role in the maintenance of this great new order of the ages. And I thank you all so very much. Pleasure to be here tonight.